The flood left 57 tons of tangled Blackwood, blocking her lower pasture completely. Most saw a devastating nightmare. She saw rare tight-grain white oak seasoned by 60 years of cold running water. The county man arrived with an aluminum clipboard and an $80 per ton disposal quote. She said 4 words. "The timber stays here." Then she picked up the saw. The mud sucked at her boots when she shifted her weight. And she didn't shift it much. Nora Vance stood at the bottom of the lower pasture at 6:15 in the morning, with her grandfather's draw knife hanging loose in her right hand. The hickory handle was still dark and smooth from 40 years of his palm oil. She looked at what Blackwood Creek had done. 57 tons. That is what Calloway County would eventually call it, on official paper. What it looked like was the skeleton of a wrecked wooden barge. Trunks stacked crossways over each other in a chaotic jam 90 feet wide. Root balls the size of pickup trucks jutting up at harsh, improbable angles into the gray dawn. Black silt drying in cracked plates over everything, so the whole pile looked like it had been dragged out of an abandoned coal seam. Water still ran under it somewhere. A low rumble you could feel through the thick rubber soles of your boots, more than you could hear with your ears. 4 days of heavy autumn rain did it, October of 1988. The kind of rain that does not come in quick, dramatic bursts, but sets in like an uninvited tenant who has no intention of leaving. The rainfall gauge mounted on the oak barn post overflowed at 10 inches, and she simply quit checking it. On the 3rd night, Blackwood Creek came out of its banks 2 miles upstream, where the old timber trestle pinched the channel down to a narrow bottleneck. And it went looking for somewhere to deposit 60 years of drowned trees. It found her lower pasture. It backed up against the rusted, woven wire fence line, tore out 500 feet of weathered cedar posts, and stacked everything it had been carrying since Lord knows when into a solid plug that ran from the road culvert clear to the big sycamore. She had owned the place 16 months. 160 acres, most of it steep timbered ridge, 20 of it decent bottomland that had just been converted into a massive log yard. A barn with a sagging north wall that groaned whenever the north wind blew. A 30-inch band saw sitting under a sun-bleached tarp, 3-phase power, older than she was, that Elias Vance had bought at an estate sale in Murray 30 years ago, and never once explained why. And 14 notebooks bound in cracked brown leather resting in a bread box. That was the entire inheritance. No cash. There had been $2,000 in a rusted lard tin under the floorboards. And she had spent every cent of it, replacing the rotted shingles on the farmhouse roof. Elias had been dead 16 months, and she still caught herself saving small pieces of news to tell him at breakfast. By 8 in the morning, the local spectators started arriving. Not to offer a hand, rural Kentucky is built on a quiet, detached kind of observation. A natural disaster is free morning entertainment if it happens to land on the other fellow's acreage. Pickups slowed down at the top of the gravel lane, idled for a minute, then moved on. A battered blue Chevrolet stopped, right at the fence line, with 2 men in the cab. One of them leaned out the open window, resting his elbow on the rusted door panel, and laughed loud enough to carry 300 yards down the slope. "Hell of a firewood pile, Nora. You planning to sell it by the matchbox?" Nora did not turn around. That detail is worth sitting with. She heard every single syllable. She just did not have any spare energy to spend on him. She adjusted her grip on the draw knife handle, tugged the collar of her faded olive canvas jacket up against the cold river wind, and started walking the outer perimeter of the jam. Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now let's begin. Here is what she was doing that nobody standing at the fence line understood. She was taking a physical inventory. She counted root balls first, 22 of them, which meant 22 whole trees that had been ripped straight out of a clay bank, roots and soil attached, torn loose by a creek that had been undercutting that upstream bend since long before her grandfather was born. Then she looked for cut ends. That is the tell. A cut end is flat, square, and clean, meaning a human being put a 2-man crosscut saw to that tree decades ago. She found 38 flat ends. 38 heavy logs that someone had felled, bucked, and lost off a logging wagon, off a splash dam, or off a railroad siding back in the 1930s, when the commercial timber crews cleared these ridges and floated raw logs down to the river mills at high water, losing a third of their harvest on every single run. Losses. Sunk for over half a century, sitting in cold, moving creek water with virtually no oxygen, which happens to be the single place on this earth where dense hardwood does not rot. She stopped at a massive log resting 6 feet from the sycamore tree. The outer bark was long gone, worn smooth by decades of water flow. Where the force of the recent flood had ground 2 heavy trunks together, something had scraped through the thick silt crust, down to the raw wood underneath. She jammed her thumbnail against the exposed face. It did not yield, it was hard as bone. She set the steel edge of the draw knife against the fiber and pulled one thin curl, about 5 inches long. The shaving peeled away with a crisp slicing sound, and the fresh wood underneath was deep chocolate brown, almost purple at the core. Not gray, not spongy, dark oily heavy wood with a tight wave in the grain where a massive branch had once joined the trunk. Old-growth white oak, and that ripple in the grain meant figure. She stood knee-deep in the freezing mud, holding a wet shaving between her thumb and forefinger, turning it slowly in the pale morning light. The small birthmark on her left jaw caught the sun. She did not smile. Women on the ridge do not smile at the beginning of hard work. But her pulse quickened. 60 years under cold running water does something to dense white oak that no modern drying kiln can ever replicate. Minerals migrate into the cell walls over decades. The color goes deep, even, and dark instead of streaky. The timber stabilizes, stops fighting its own internal tension, and stops moving with the changing weather. Fine furniture builders in Boston and Chicago paid absurd prices for river-recovered oak, and most could never source it because finding it usually meant diving into dangerous river channels with commercial scuba gear. Hers was sitting right on dry land, on her land, stacked 90 feet wide and 12 feet high, blocking her lower pasture completely. She walked the entire length of the timber jam 3 times, stepping carefully over slippery root wads and tangled limbs, noting the position of every trunk. She pulled her lead pencil from behind her ear and made small, precise marks on the inside cover of her pocket notebook, mapping the structural orientation of the pile. The men at the fence line eventually tired of watching a woman walk through mud in silence. The blue Chevrolet shifted into gear, its exhaust pipe spitting a blue cloud of oil smoke into the cold air as it rattled away up the ridge road. The quiet returned to Blackwood Creek, broken only by the steady gurgle of water, forcing its way through the subterranean channels beneath the timber. Nora knelt by the edge of the water, dipping her hands into the freezing stream to wash the thick silt off her fingers. The water was 46 degrees, sharp enough to turn her skin red within seconds, but she barely noticed the chill. She wiped her hands on her canvas jacket, reached down to pick up her grandfather's draw knife, and began her trek up the long, muddy hill toward the house. Nora walked back up the long slope to the house, with her denim jeans soaked black to the knees and her heavy leather work boots slopping with dark river clay. She sat at the scarred oak kitchen table, without taking her faded canvas jacket off, feeling the damp chill radiating off her wet trousers. The 14 leather-bound notebooks sat inside a galvanized sunbeam bread box on top of the cast-iron wood stove, right where Elias had always stored them, because he maintained that paper keeps its crispness where the field mice cannot figure out the latch mechanism. She pulled the 3rd volume from the box and laid it flat on the worn oilcloth tablecloth. That was when the cold arithmetic began. And the arithmetic was completely merciless. She had no heavy skidder, she had no bulldozer, she had no winch truck equipped with a boom. There was no gravel road leading down to Blackwood Creek, and there never had been one, because Elias had run shorthorn cattle in that bottomland pasture for 40 years, and cattle do not require a graded haul road. The nearest flat ground, where a fully loaded tandem axle log truck could turn around, was 700 feet uphill through a soft sloping pasture that would not support a riding lawnmower until mid-July. She pulled her bank passbook from her jacket pocket and opened it to the last stamped entry. The balance at Farmers and Merchants Bank in Cadiz stood at exactly $184.20. The 30-inch bandsaw in the equipment shed had not been connected to 3-phase electrical power in 11 years. She was looking at roughly $50,000 worth of historical, river-cured timber sitting submerged in the mud, and she possessed not a single practical, modern way on God's earth to move or process a 6-foot diameter oak log. She turned the cover of the 3rd notebook to the flyleaf, where her grandfather had written a single line in heavy lead pencil, pressing hard enough to groove the thick paper permanently. Waste is just a failure of imagination. She sat in the quiet kitchen, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the gentle hum of the wind against the northern window panes. She knew every inch of this 160-acre farm. She knew where the springs bubbled up through the limestone in late March, where the wild blackberries grew thickest along the ridge line, and where her grandfather had buried his old plow horses when their working days were done. The land was not just real estate to her. It was a living record of every sweat-stained afternoon Elias had spent clearing rock and mending cedar posts. Morning came up gray, heavy, and damp over Whitetail Ridge, and the sound that shattered the stillness at 7:30 was the heavy crunch of tires on wet gravel. A county road department pickup truck rolled up the long lane, with its yellow strobe lights flashing slow and deliberate, as if the driver wanted to ensure she heard his arrival from half a mile away. Gideon Cross stepped down out of the cab, with a heavy aluminum clipboard already gripped firmly in his right hand. Rimless glasses with silver arms, short steel gray hair combed straight back with military precision, and a pressed navy blue windbreaker, worn over a starched denim shirt. He wore polished leather work boots, pristine tan boots chosen specifically for farm site visits, which told anyone watching precisely how much real mud he intended to touch with his feet. He had printed his official disposal quote before he ever drove past her rusty mailbox on the main road. He had already determined what her land was worth before he ever laid eyes on a single log in the bottomland. Nora came off the porch steps in her olive canvas jacket, her honey blonde braid draped over her left shoulder. The brass folding rule was clipped securely to her belt loop, right where it had hung on her grandfather's hip for 40 years. She stopped 10 feet out in the gravel drive and stood her ground, her hands hanging loose at her sides. "Miss Vance," Gideon said, offering a tight, practiced smile. It was a purely professional smile. That is the thing about men like Gideon Cross. The cruelty never arrives with a raised voice or a slammed truck door. It arrives at room temperature with an official printed form, a polite nod, and a handshake. "I'll make this straightforward and easy for you," Gideon continued, stepping closer while keeping his polished boots on the dry gravel. "What you have sitting down in your lower pasture is a severe environmental hazard. Storm debris, unstable river timber, roughly 57 tons of downed trees, clogging a primary county drainage waterway. The road department is prepared to step in and assist you under the emergency spillover code." He turned the aluminum clipboard around so she could see the neatly typed fee schedule attached to the front. "Burn permits are already signed off on my end," Gideon said, tapping the paper with his index finger. "I bring an excavator operator and a haul crew in on Thursday morning. We windrow the entire mass, torch what is dry enough to catch fire, and haul the rest to the county landfill. $80 a ton disposal fee. Call it 57 tons. You are completely clean by late August." "Clean." He said the word as if the earth itself had contracted a shameful, contagious disease. Nora did not answer immediately. Gideon kept talking, because men in administrative positions fill silence, the way moving water fills a low spot in the road. "I know this place meant a great deal to old Elias," Gideon said, leaning slightly on his front foot and gesturing toward the barn. "Sentiment is fine for Sunday morning at church, but sentiment doesn't clear drainage ditches. And it certainly doesn't pay county property taxes. Frankly, a young woman out here running 160 acres alone, you would be doing yourself a massive favor. Take the cleared lot, seed it in fescue, lease it out to a local cattle farmer who has the proper machinery." Elias never cleared a real profit off this ground, and he had 40 years to try. There it was, laid out in plain, unvarnished English. He was not merely offering a county maintenance service. He was telling a 25-year-old woman that her grandfather had spent his entire life on a fool's errand, that she was repeating the exact same mistake, and that the kindest thing the county could do was scrape her inheritance flat and let a real commercial farmer take over the lease. Nora's face remained completely still. The pale thumbprint birthmark on her left jaw caught the cold morning light, and her gray-blue eyes stayed fixed on his face without blinking. She asked one question, her voice even and quiet. "Who keeps the timber?" Gideon raised his chin half an inch, hooking his thumb into his leather belt. "Salvage rights transferred directly to the county contractor. Standard procedure under municipal flood management ordinances. Anything millable, we handle the transport and off-take. Keeps your out-of-pocket costs down." And there was the entire game laid out in 16 words. He was going to charge her $4,560 to remove prime, old-growth white oak, and black walnut from her own pasture, and then take the timber himself. She pays him to haul her inheritance off her property. He sells that same historical timber to commercial lumber mills, and he deposits the check directly into the county road maintenance fund. Keeps my costs down, Nora said, her voice flat, not phrasing it as a question. That's right, Gideon replied, extending a black pen toward her. Sign right at the red arrow on the bottom line. I will have the heavy equipment operator here. Thursday morning at 7. Nora took the paper. She turned it over to the blank reverse side. Standing in the gravel lane in her worn, mud-stained jeans, she pulled the lead pencil from behind her ear and did the arithmetic right in front of his eyes. 57 tons at $80 per ton equaled 4,560s out of a checking account that contained $180.20. Then she wrote the opposite column on the paper. 60 primary logs sitting in the creek bed. White oak, red oak, and 12 old-growth black walnuts. The walnuts that Elias had watched mature along the fence line for 40 years. Even at bottom dollar, rough sawn veneer prices, clear quarter sawn stock from those massive dimensions came out to well over $45,000. She was being asked to pay $4,560 for the privilege of handing over $45,000 worth of river-cured hardwood. Nora folded the official quote once and looked Gideon straight in the eyes. The timber stays here. 4 words. That was all she gave him. Gideon blinked behind his rimless lenses. He waited for the rest of it. The nervous apology, the polite explanations, the soft laugh that lets a man like him take control of the conversation again. Nothing came. Nora stood her ground, square-shouldered, still, while an old Rhode Island red hen came around the corner of the equipment barn and pecked at the toe of his polished boot. You'll be calling my office before first frost, Gideon said, his professional smile dissolving completely into a thin line. That wood will be rotten, waterlogged, and infested with wood-boring beetles by September, and you will be paying double to haul out decayed slush. He set the official quote on the cedar fence post, going out the lane, pinned firmly under a flat rock. The way you leave an overdue utility bill for someone you fully expect to come crawling back on their knees. The county road pickup backed down the long gravel lane, its tires spraying small stones into the weeds. The dust hung in the damp morning air and slowly settled into the grass. Nora stood by the fence post for a long time, watching the blue smoke from the pickup truck vanish over the crest of Whitetail Ridge. She picked up the folded quote from beneath the rock, put it in her jacket pocket, and walked back toward the kitchen door. Inside, she opened the galvanized bread box and pulled out the second notebook. The pages from 1964 through 1971 were filled with Elias's precise, squared-off block letters detailing air-drying times, wood moisture evaporation rates, and structural timber grading. She turned to a page dated August 14, 1967, where her grandfather had drawn a detailed cross-section of an oak trunk showing the growth rings. Beneath the drawing he had written, "Water does not ruin wood. Air ruins wood when it carries rot spores. Keep it cold, keep it buried, or seal it tight, and timber will wait for you longer than a man will wait for his supper." Nora set her pencil on the table, pulled her brass folding rule from her belt loop, and laid it across the notebook page. She was 25 years old, sitting in an unheated kitchen with less than $200 to her name, facing 57 tons of river debris that the entire county expected her to surrender. But as she looked down at her grandfather's handwriting, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was not going to sign a single piece of county paper. The county heard about Nora's refusal before the sun dipped behind the timberline on Whitetail Ridge. A road grader operator mentioned it to a clerk at the feed store in Cadiz, and the clerk passed it along to the deacon's wife at the Baptist church. By the following afternoon, Nora Vance was known across Calloway County as the headstrong girl on the ridge who had turned down official county help, sitting on 57 tons of river debris with less than $200 in the bank, too stubborn to accept the reality of her situation. June Atwater heard it while standing by the co-op counter with her chipped enamel coffee mug in her hand. She did not say a word either way, which in Calloway County counted as a rare form of loyalty. Nora ignored the town talk completely. She spent her evenings at the kitchen table under the steady yellow glow of an oil lamp, the third notebook open beside a clean sheet of yellow legal paper. Elias's handwriting in the winter of 1968 was composed of nothing but drying schedules, timber grain notes, and weather logs. Air dry 1 year per inch of board thickness, stickered every 16 inches on the level. sealed at the end grain with hot wax within 60 minutes of the cut. Or the checking will run 2 feet up the heartwood before the saw blade ever touches it again. White oak wants shade during its first summer on the ground, or the fresh face goes gray and brittle. Red oak dries slow and stubborn, or it honeycombs from the inside out where no man can see the damage until the blade finds it. And then, underlined twice in faded graphite, everybody burns the knotty crotch wood because it tears up cheap planer knives. That is why it is free. The figure is hidden where the tree fought its own weight against the wind. She read that single sentence 4 times before closing the book. October water in Blackwood Creek ran at 46 degrees Fahrenheit. That is cold enough to make your shin bones ache with a dull, throbbing pain within 10 minutes, and cold enough to turn your feet completely numb after 20. Nora went in anyway. She laced her leather boots tight, pinned her honey blonde braid up under the collar of her canvas jacket so it would not drag in the silt, and clipped the brass folding rule to her belt loop where it always rode. There were 60 major trunks locked into that 57-ton jam. She intended to examine every single one of them before moving a single stick. Sunk timber wears a slippery, foul coat of black silt and river algae that makes dense white oak look like rotting poplar, and black walnut look like worthless driftwood. You cannot trust the surface appearance. You have to chip. Nora worked her way along the cold perimeter with a sharp 2-pound hand hatchet, taking one clean thumb-deep bite out of each log, creating a test notch the size of a playing card through the weathered skin into the living wood underneath. Then she knelt in the mud, brought her face down within 3 inches of the cut, and used her senses. White oak came up dense, tan, and heavy, smelling faintly of old cider barrels and bitter tannic acid. Red oak ran pinkish-brown with wide open pores, smelling sharp and acidic. Black walnut showed deep purple chocolate at the heart, smelling like a spice cabinet somebody had left open in an attic. Hackberry smelled like stagnant pond water. Sycamore smelled like wet paper. She marked each log with a bright yellow lumber crayon, O for oak, W for walnut, followed by an inventory number. By the 14th log, she began adding a small star whenever the test chip showed grain that did not run straight and predictable, but rippled, curled, and doubled back on itself, like water going around a river boulder. Figure. The very thing high-end furniture craftsmen in distant cities paid absurd money for, and local sawmills dismissed as a structural defect that ruined straight-framing timber. Log 28 received 3 stars. It was an enormous white oak butt section, 4 feet across at the swell, completely encrusted in river clay and dried algae. The test chip came out dark hazelnut brown, with a shimmering wave across the thorses that shifted continuously whenever she turned her wrist in the pale sunlight. Then came the dangerous part, mapping the physical mechanics of the pile. A 57-ton log jam is not a loose heap of fallen sticks. It is a precarious, highly unstable building, held under immense hydraulic tension. Water pushes continuously against the upstream face. Dozens of heavy trunks stacked crosswise have locked together under thousands of pounds of force. Somewhere near the bottom of the pile sits the keystone. Cut or pull the keystone first, and 4 tons of saturated hardwood will roll simultaneously into the water, trapping anything in its path beneath the surface. Nora worked from the top down, never once cutting a log that held another log resting on top of it. She had no tractor, no skidder, and no engine-driven winch truck. She had a hand-cranked come-along rated at 2 tons, a heavy steel snatch block pulley, and 80 feet of 3/8-inch braided wire cable. The snatch block was her entire mechanical advantage. She ran her cable from the target log, through the steel pulley anchored to a 40-year-old sycamore tree on the high bank, and back to the winch handle. Physics does not care that an operator is a lone 25-year-old woman standing knee-deep in freezing mud. It simply executes the mathematical law of leverage. 4 logs a day, that was her absolute limit. Crank, reset, the steel ratchet handle clacking steadily against the quiet of the creek bottom, the wire cable singing high and tight under tension like a guitar string. That long, grueling drag of saturated timber sliding inch by inch up the slippery clay bank. 4 logs a day through the end of October and straight into the cold rains of November. Her knuckles cracked at the joints from the freezing creek water, and her forearms burned with a continuous ache by noon every single day. The massive butt swells, the fat lumpy sections near the roots, that commercial sawmills usually bucked off and threw into the county burn pile, she stacked separately on dry cedar skids up out of the river mud. Those were the burls, the tree's ancient scar tissue, wrapped in wild, multi-directional grain. A burl is the tree's physical response to injury or fungal stress. The trunk throws out thousands of dormant buds that never open, wrapping them in wood year after year, until you have a massive lump that mills like a fever dream. There is no grain direction inside a burl. It swirls, knots, and ripples in every direction at once, making it a nightmare to plane, but creating the single most valuable figure in North American timber. And the creek water. This was the part that sounded completely backward to everyone at the feed store. The river had preserved them. Wood does not rot from water alone. It rots from fungal infection, and fungus requires oxygen to survive. Sink a log in cold, low oxygen, sediment-heavy creek water, and you have constructed a fungus-proof storage vault. The water forces its way into the cell walls. The natural tannins leach and darken the interior. And after 60 years down in the silt, you pull out timber that is denser and darker than anything standing in the woods above it. By the second week of November, she had 26 prime logs resting safely on the high bank. She was ready to begin sawing. Elias's old bandsaw sat beneath the open tin roof of the equipment shed. It was a 1971 model with 30-inch cast-iron wheels, driven by a 3-phase electric motor she had finally wired, using a heavy rotary phase converter she bought with her last remaining cash. She sharpened the carbon steel band blade by hand using a flat file, setting each tooth angle with painstaking care. She selected a test piece, a straight red oak log, 14 inches across, no burls, no figure, a basic ordinary log. She fired up the motor. The long steel blade whined into a high pitch, throwing a golden plume of damp, sweet-smelling sawdust across the concrete floor. The first slab came off at 8/4 thickness, 2 full inches. It was stunning, dark pinkish red, streaked with mineral gray from decades in the silt. She ran her bare thumb across the freshly cut face. The wood felt cool and damp to the touch. She sawned 3 more slabs, stacking them flat on concrete blocks behind the shed, right where the cool November wind blew steadily through the valley, day and night. That was her first catastrophic mistake. Green, river-recovered oak sits at nearly 80% moisture content. If you dry the outer surface faster than the internal moisture can migrate outward through the dense cells, the outer shell shrinks violently against a wet, unyielding core. The wood has no choice but to tear itself apart along its natural medullary rays. 4 days later, while sitting on the porch drinking morning coffee, Nora heard the first sharp crack. It sounded like a small caliber rifle shot echoing from the equipment shed. By the 7th day, all 4 test slabs had split end to end. An estimated $600 worth of clear red oak had opened up like a book nobody would ever pay to read, ruined by deep, jagged surface checks, running 3 feet down the center of each board. Nora did not panic, nor did she shed a tear. She walked out to the shed, knelt in the cold sawdust, and unclipped the brass folding rule from her belt loop. She measured the depth of the cracks, following the splits from the end grain inward, documenting the structural failure, like a land surveyor, mapping a fault line. 14 inches on the first slab, 16 on the second, 9.5 on the third. The fourth had split clean through a tight knot and kept going. Every single crack had originated at the exposed end grain. It was not a defect in the wood, it was a basic law of physics. Water leaves a green board through the open cell tubes of the end grain 10 to 12 times faster than it escapes through the flat face. The ends dry instantly, shrink and pull apart, while the center remains saturated, fat and stubborn. Something has to tear. Her grandfather had understood that physical law 50 years before she was born. That evening, Nora searched through the leather-bound notebooks by the light of a flashlight, because the barn wiring was still half a rat's nest. On page 141 of Dell's cramped block print, she found the entry, "Seal the ends or lose the board." Beneath the entry was a smear of something waxy that had soaked into the paper and turned translucent decades ago, followed by a recipe. Paraffin wax cut with a little beeswax, melted low over a camp stove, brushed scalding hot onto the fresh end grain within 1 hour of the cut. Underneath that, underlined twice in heavy lead pencil, 1 inch per year. Air, not heat. You cannot hurry wood without breaking its heart. 1 inch per year. Her slabs were 2 inches thick. 18 months. That was the sentence. 18 months of letting the wood sit in the dark, breathing out its internal moisture at a rate she could not rush, while her checking account held $184.20, and the farm's propane tank was dropping toward empty in the middle of a Kentucky winter. Have you ever had the correct answer land in your lap and realized the answer cost more in patience than you had in cash? She built the drying stack anyway. That was simply who she was. The base went down first, because a drying stack is only as straight as the ground underneath it. She leveled 6 heavy pressure-treated runners on concrete blocks, checking each one meticulously with a bubble level, shimming until nothing rocked. Any dip in that base transfers a permanent warp into every board stacked above it. A board that dries with a bow in it, a board that stays bowed forever. Wood remembers the shape you let it take while it is wet. Then came the stickers, 3/4-inch wooden spacer strips, ripped dead uniform out of dry scrap wood, placed crosswise every 16 inches. Every sticker in every layer was stacked directly over the one below it, so the immense weight ran down in straight vertical columns to the concrete footings. Miss that alignment by 2 inches, and the load sags into the gaps, creating permanent waves in the lumber. 3/4 inch was not a random number either. Too thin, and the air stalls between the layers, causing gray mold to bloom across the sapwood. Too thick, and the outside faces dry too fast, bringing you right back to surface checking. Over the top of the completed stack, she secured a sheet of corrugated tin weighted down with heavy cinder blocks, leaving a 6-inch air gap beneath it. Sun off the top layer, rain off everything, and the sides she left wide open, all 4 of them, because the entire system ran on moving valley air and nothing else. No electric fans, no artificial heat, no shortcuts. She stood back in the cold dusk and looked at it. It was the ugliest structure on the property, and it was the only thing on the property that was actually working. Here is the cold arithmetic that nobody talks about in stories like this. Green slabs sell, not for much, $40 or $60 a piece to a local craftsman, with a shop and a planer who is willing to take on the drying risk himself. She had, by her own count in the ledger, 80 usable slabs sitting in the yard right now in a winter, where she needed $800 just to keep the propane flowing and the lights on. Dried and stable, those exact same slabs were worth $400 each to fine furniture makers in distant cities. But she had to survive 18 months to find out if she was right. She sold nothing. She sealed every end grain with hot wax, stacked every board according to the rule, and walked away from quick cash, because her grandfather had written 1 inch per year in a notebook, and she believed a dead man's experience over her own immediate hunger. That was the hardest arithmetic in this entire story, and she executed it on a freezing Tuesday morning, with white frost thick on the tin roof. June Atwater came to the fence line 4 days later. She had her chipped enamel mug in one hand and a battered thermos in the other, wearing a mustard yellow quilted vest zipped straight to her chin and rubber boots sunk 2 inches into the lane mud. She did not say a word about the drying stack. She did not ask what it cost. She did not do the thing everyone else in Calloway County had been doing since the flood trucks arrived, which was smile with their mouths and laugh with their eyes. She simply poured a second cup of hot black coffee and held it over the wire fence line. Nora took it with bare mud-stained hands. Her blonde braid had come half loose at her temples. There was gray wax under her fingernails. And she had been awake since 4 in the morning, splitting cedar kindling. They stood there together in the bitter cold. 2 rural women, looking at a massive pile of stacked timber, saying nothing for 3 full minutes. "My husband dried white oak," June said finally, her breath clouding in the cold air. "Took forever. He was insufferable to live with while he waited." Nora drank the coffee, feeling the heat spread through her hands. "It's the ends," Nora said softly. "You have to seal the ends." That was the entire conversation. It was also the first time in 16 months that anyone on that ridge road had spoken to her, as if she actually knew what she was doing. Winter came in hard that December, and the thing that kept her alive was not the prime oak slabs. It was the garbage wood. Every crooked limb, every knotty crotch section, every unmillable log that Gideon Cross's road crew would have thrown into the county incinerator, she bucked into 16-inch rounds and split by hand with a heavy steel maul, until her forearms ached and her palms cracked open at the base of every finger. She stacked the firewood in neat face cords along the edge of the driveway. $45 a rick delivered, and she delivered it herself in Elias's old rusted pickup truck, with a jump-started battery and a heater that only blew lukewarm air. 211 ricks of firewood that winter. She ate groceries bought with limbs the county had classified as worthless debris. And in March, when the last of the deep frost lifted out of the clay ground, She went down the drying line one final time, with the wax pot steaming over a small propane camp burner, brushing hot paraffin over every fresh-cut end grain until every board was sealed tight and every sticker sat true in its column. Then she set the horsehair brush down, wiped her hands on her canvas jacket, and started the long, silent wait. February arrived on Whitetail Ridge, with a bitter, motionless cold that froze Blackwood Creek solid along the bank edges. At 1:30 in the morning, the kitchen window of the old farmhouse was the only pane of glass holding light for 2 miles in any direction. Beneath the low-hanging bulb, resting on the worn oilcloth table, lay a formal farm operating loan application from Farmers and Merchants Bank. 4 pages of dense, small print with an unsharpened lead pencil, laid across the top page like an iron latch drawn across a heavy wooden door. Nora Vance had not written a single word on it. The table held the full, unvarnished arithmetic of her existence that night. The loan application sat next to an overdue propane bill, stamped with a bold red diagonal stripe across the statement envelope. The 100-gallon aluminum storage tank behind the house was reading 11% on the mechanical dial, and 11% in February in Calloway County was not an abstract number. It was a physical countdown toward frozen pipes. Beside it lay a county property tax note for $512, 30 due on the 4th of March, and her bank passbook showing an exact balance of $184. $184. Sitting against a stack of 57 tons of river-recovered white oak that 8 prominent men in the county had publicly classified as worthless firewood. Nora sat completely still, her dark honey-blonde braid draped over her left shoulder, her gray-blue eyes fixed on the blank loan agreement. The brass folding rule remained clipped to her belt loop, right where it always stayed, even sitting at her own kitchen table, at 1:30 in the morning, when there was nothing left on earth to measure. She had 2 clear doors available to her that winter, and both of them stood wide open. Door number 1 was named $35,000, an agricultural operating loan offered by the loan desk at the Cadiz branch, secured against the 160 acres of timbered ridge. 7.2% interest, 5-year term, first payment due in 90 days. It was enough money to fill the propane tank to the brim, clear the county property taxes, and buy a modern dehumidification timber kiln, instead of waiting through 18 months of slow air drying. It was enough to make the physical ache in her shoulders vanish instantly. And it was enough, if one bad drought season or timber market drop hit the region, to hand a commercial bank the deed to ground her grandfather had paid for with 41 years of physical labor. Door number 2 was smaller, uglier, and required no legal signature whatsoever. A bulk timber buyer out of Bowling Green had left a concise message on her tape machine, offering $4,500 for the entire raw timber pile sitting by the creek, site taken, hauled off within 7 days. $4,500 for what Gideon Cross had attempted to charge her a $4,563 disposal fee to receive. That was the detail that made your teeth grind if you sat with it too long. Gideon had not merely dumped the county's flood problem onto her lower pasture. He had billed her for the privilege. And when she had asked him back in October what the road department intended to do with the remaining river logs upstream, he had tipped his chin up over his rimless glasses, hooked his thumbs into his belt, and said it plain. "Sweetheart, that's rot. You're welcome to it. Some people can't tell the difference between an inheritance and a junk pile." He had said it smiling. He had said it with the quiet confidence of a man who believed his version of reality would remain unchallenged forever. So at 1:30 in the morning, Nora sat between 2 choices, $4,500 for total surrender, or $35,000 for a rope with her own land tied to the far end of it. Have you ever wagered your entire future on an idea that not a single living person around you believed in? It is not a comfortable feeling. It is not a bet with a floor under it. It is the kind of wager where the only human being who ever told you it would work is dead and buried on a hill you can see from the kitchen sink window. Nora sat with that reality for a long, silent hour. Then she stood up, walked across the cold linoleum to the shelf by the wood stove, and brought back the 4th leather-bound notebook. Elias's cramped block handwriting filled 160 pages of that book, small level letters written by a man who kept his forearm flat on the wood while he wrote. But the final entry was different from the rest. The letters leaned sharply to the right, the lines wavered, and the final sentence dropped completely off the blue ruling. It was dated 11 days before his heart failed. It read, "Cut the crotchwood out of the big white oak by the fence line." Figure 18 months to dry properly. I will not live to see it seasoned. Somebody ought to. Waste is just a failure of imagination. He had said that sentence to her 100 times over 100 family suppers. It had sounded, when she was younger, like an old farmer's justification for never throwing away an old rusty bolt or an iron hinge. Sitting at that table with $184.20 left in the world, it read like a direct military command. Nora took the bank loan application, folded it in half once, and fed it directly into the glowing firebox of the cast iron stove. She did not need quick cash, she needed true market valuation. Sell the timber as raw bulk logs to a local sawmill, and you are a commodity seller, competing with industrial timber crews who own logging trucks, skidders, and rail lines. You will take 3 cents on the dollar, and be expected to thank them for the check. But process the timber yourself, identify the rare figure, and sell directly to high-end artisans. The Luthiers, custom gunstock makers, and one-man fine furniture builders, who would pay for a single-figured crotch slab what a commercial mill pays for an entire truckload of raw oak, and you are no longer in the lumber business at all. 50 select pieces sold a year to master builders beat one raw pile sold to a regional mill every single time. Spring came in fast and uncommonly dry that April. By the middle of the month, the air inside her open drying shed carried a crisp, papery aroma, the distinct, clean smell that signals the free surface water has left the wood cells and isn't coming back on its own. Nora pulled the top slab off her primary test stack. A 30-inch wide crotch cut off the massive white oak log she had salvaged from the center of the jam, the very log Gideon Cross had poked with his boot, while calling it storm debris. She carried the heavy slab to her workbench, her forearms trembling slightly under the 70-pound weight. She set it flat on the bench, wiped the surface dust away with her sleeve, and picked up the heavy iron jack plane Elias had rehandled with hickory in 1965. The first pass of the steel blade took off gray, weathered skin, just dead, chalky fiber curling away in a ribbon the color of dry dirt. The second pass revealed a pale tan shadow underneath. On the third pass, something moved beneath the sharp edge. Have you ever uncovered something valuable that had been hidden for half a century and had to stop working just to take a breath? Because that is precisely what happened in that shed. The figure emerged from the raw board, like a riverbed seen through perfectly clear ice. Quilted, rippling thorses of grain rolled across the surface, light shifting across the wood fibers, and then reversing direction whenever she tilted her head, the way sunlight moves across deep water when wind touches it. Chatoyance is the technical term for it. The wood fibers had been compressed into tight, permanent waves where the massive tree had divided into 2 heavy limbs 80 years ago, every fiber ending at the planed surface at a different angle, so each cell caught the light like an individual mirror. That is all figure really is. Frozen in time. The tree fought its own immense weight against the valley winds for a century, and the fight got written permanently into the grain structure. Gideon Cross had quoted her an $80 a ton disposal fee for this exact wood. Nora planed a clean window about 10 inches square, right in the heart of the crotch figure, and then she stopped because she refused to remove a single millimeter more thickness than necessary. She stood there with her blonde braid hanging down her back, her gray-blue eyes 9 inches from the polished surface, and she understood something that takes most commercial lumber dealers an entire career to grasp. This was not board footage. Construction lumber gets sold by the board foot, 12 inches by 12 inches by 1 inch thick. And in 1989 in Calloway County, plain white oak brought maybe $2.50 a board foot at the mill. By that crude math, the slab resting on her workbench was worth about $90. Figured tonewood does not sell by the board foot. Figured tonewood sells by what it does to a craftsman's face when he lays his hands on the surface. She wrote it down in Elias's 4th notebook on a fresh page in her own hand, directly beneath his last entry. Board feet measure quantity. Nobody buys quantity when they are building something to last. They buy the one board they cannot take their eyes off of. The practical problem was that nobody within 60 miles of Whitetail Ridge wanted it. The local cabinet shops built utility cupboards out of straight red oak and poplar, and considered a figured or curly slab a structural defect, hard to plane without tear out, unpredictable when glued, and prone to shifting. The local men who called her timber junk were not lying. They simply lacked the specialized tools and patience required to work figured hardwood, and had decided that their own limitations made the wood worthless. So Nora went completely around them. She cut 24 small sample blocks, 4 inches by 4 inches square, 3/4 of an inch thick. She planed and hand-oiled one face with raw linseed oil to expose the deep, chocolate-brown figure, leaving the opposite face raw and rough-sawn so a prospective buyer could see exactly what he would be starting with. On the square edge of every sample block, she stamped 3 numbers using steel hand dies. The exact date the log came out of Blackwood Creek, the date it was milled on the bandsaw, and the current moisture meter reading. She wrapped each sample block in clean newsprint paper. She gathered addresses from Luthier supply advertisements in the back of 3 specialized music magazines at the county library, a director's list from a woodworking guild in Louisville, and 2 names June Atwater had retrieved from a cousin in Indiana. 24 brown paper packages. Postage at the small Cadiz post office came to $21.40. June Atwater stood in the equipment shed doorway in her yellow quilted vest, holding her chipped enamel mug, watching Nora address the final package with a broad-nibbed black pen. 24, June said, blowing steam off her coffee. You expecting all 24 of those fancy shops to write you back? No, Nora said. That was the entire conversation. Nora loaded the box into the truck and drove to the post office. 19 of those packages generated no response whatsoever, not a postcard, not a phone call, nothing. 2 shop owners wrote back polite, form rejection notes, stating his guitar shop was committed to an Oregon supplier through 1991. The other explaining that figured White Oak presented finishing challenges his clientele did not appreciate, which was simply a polite way of saying he lacked the skill to plane curly grain. Nora kept both rejection letters, pinned them to the wooden support post beside her bandsaw, and went back to her work. July arrived hot, humid, and heavy. The air inside the drying shed reached 95 degrees by noon, and Nora worked in a sleeveless work shirt, her shoulders browned by the sun, unstacking and inspecting the slabs one by one. She stickered every new cut with kiln-dried spacers, so air moved evenly across every square inch of surface. Twice a week, she pressed the 2 steel pins of her moisture meter into the end grain of the control boards and logged the numbers in a fresh spiral notebook. 14%, 12, 5%, 11%. The telephone on the kitchen wall rang on a scorching Tuesday morning in late July at 10:07 a.m. A man's voice, rapid, caffeinated, speaking with a distinct Pacific Northwest cadence, asked for Nora Vance. He had obtained one of her 4x4 sample blocks from a friend who had retrieved it from a discarded trash box in a Seattle shop. He didn't introduce himself for 40 seconds because he was too busy firing rapid technical questions. Was the oak flat sawn or quarter sawn? Crotch cuts mostly, Nora said, holding the receiver against her ear with her shoulder, while her hands swept sawdust off the kitchen table. Flat sawn through the figure. You cannot quarter a crotch swell without destroying the wave. What is the current moisture reading? He demanded. 10. 5% at the end grain, 11% in the deep core, she replied instantly. Air dried under roof on Whitetail Ridge since October of '88. Has it been stable? Any internal checking? Any twist? Initial checking in the first test lot before I sealed the end grain with beeswax, Nora said evenly. 0 checking since the wax went on. The boards are flat as slate. Then he asked the single question that truly mattered. Where did this timber originate? She told him the exact truth. A cold, mineral-rich creek bed in Calloway County, Kentucky. Trees submerged in high water decades ago, half buried in low-oxygen clay. The county road department had scheduled them for a burn pit. The man went completely silent on the line for 4 full seconds. Submerged, he said quietly, his voice tone shifting entirely. How long underwater? 50 to 60 winters, she said. He bought 12 prime-figured slabs on that single phone call. $1,650 for the lot. Buyer paying all freight charges from Cadiz, check sent via express mail that Friday. And before he hung up, he used a technical term she had never heard in her life. He called it river cured. He explained to her that slow, cold water extraction gradually leaches the harsh natural sugars out of the wood's cell walls, while river minerals seep inward, stabilizing the timber permanently and giving the dark heartwood a deep, uniform chocolate tone that no modern commercial dry kiln on earth could ever produce or replicate. Then he asked her what else she had sitting under her tin roof. The station wagon with Oregon license plates came up the gravel lane on a dry Tuesday morning 3 weeks later. The driver dropped the tailgate like a workbench. The Luthier was a small, quiet man with calloused fingers, who didn't offer a handshake, so much as he carefully inspected her hands. He walked straight past Nora without a word of small talk, walked directly under the tin roof of her drying shed, and stopped dead in his tracks. He stood there for 2 full minutes in total silence. Nora stood beside him, square-shouldered, her hands resting loose at her sides, the brass folding rule clipped to her belt loop, catching the bright August sunlight. Her silver blonde hair strands at her temples moved slightly in the warm valley breeze. She did not fill the silence with nervous chatter. She had learned 2 years ago that silence is a precise tool, no different than a sharp plane or a winch cable. "Do you have any idea what you are holding here?" he asked finally. It was not phrased as a casual question. "White oak," she said. "Old growth. Sunk in the 1930s. He laughed. A short, genuine laugh of pure astonishment, the sound a man makes when he finds a $100 bill in the pocket of an old coat he was about to throw away. He ran his bare thumb across the planed face of a quarter-sawn slab, 30-year river-seasoned white oak, the medullary rays lying across the dark grain and vibrant ribbons of pale golden fire. "This is tight grain, old-growth river-seasoned white oak," he said, turning to look at her. 16 to 18 growth rings to the inch. Nobody is cutting trees like this in America anymore. Nobody has been cutting trees like this for 40 years. And it has been seasoning in cold river silt, which is a structural process you cannot buy from a commercial dealer, cannot fake with chemicals, and cannot rush. He tapped the dense slab with his knuckle. The wood answered with a clear, bright ring, a musical note that hung in the dry shed air for a second. "The custom guitar market is starving for wood like this," he said quietly. "I know 50 master builders in 3 states who would fight each other over a single board from this stack." Here is the realization that took Nora a moment to process. She had spent 2 grueling years thinking of that 57-ton log jam as a devastating mess she had agreed to inherit out of pride and memory. 57 tons sounds like a landfill problem when a county official reads it off a clipboard. Run the physical arithmetic the way the Oregon builder did on the back of a paper envelope on her truck tailgate, and 57 tons of dry, river-recovered white oak is roughly 38,000 board feet of usable lumber. At the raw salvage junk price every local farmer assumed it was worth, that was firewood. At fine tonewood grade, sorted, air-dried, sealed, and flat, it was something else entirely. And a significant fraction of that pile, maybe 1 log in 8, carried wild curl, the ripple figure that reflects light like moving water under glass. That figured fraction had no ceiling price. It was worth whatever a master builder, who needed it to complete an instrument, was willing to pay. Nora did not celebrate. She did not jump or yell. She pulled her lead pencil from behind her ear, reached for her spiral notebook, and asked for his order specifications. What Nora built over the next 14 months would have bored anyone looking for dramatic action. Every single slab received a precise number stamped into the end grain, with a steel die. Every number went into a master ledger book. The log lot, the recovery date, the board width, the thickness, whether it was quarter-sawn, rift, or flat, and a specific designation for figure, plane, ray fleck, or curl. She borrowed June Atwater's old camera and photographed each slab against the gray barn wall, beside a small chalkboard displaying its inventory number. And June stood there in her mustard yellow vest, with her chipped enamel mug in hand, turning 70-pound slabs like a woman flipping pancakes on a Sunday morning, and never once asked why Nora was taking pictures of wood. Moisture readings received their own dedicated column in the ledger. Nora tested every stack every 2 weeks with her pin meter, logging the numbers, learning that a 2-inch white oak board can read 14% on the surface, while holding 22% in the core, and that the difference between those 2 numbers is where fine furniture goes to warp and die. She constructed her solar dehumidification kiln against the south wall of the old equipment barn, using salvaged greenhouse glass panels she hauled herself. It cost her less than $400 in raw materials, built entirely by a woman who had never taken an engineering class in her life. It worked beautifully, gently drawing bound water out of the timber cells without shocking the wood. By the 3rd autumn, the quiet transformation of Whitetail Ridge had become an established fact across 3 states. Orders arrived steadily from guitar shops in Oregon, fine furniture studios in Boston, and architectural woodworkers in Chicago. Over 36 months, Nora Vance had processed and shipped over 38,000 board feet of river-covered white oak and black walnut. Her ledger book reflected a total gross revenue of $162,400. Her total initial material investment had been $184 in truck fuel, a new chainsaw chain, and 2 replacement winch cables. The county road department pickup truck came up the gravel lane on a crisp, bright Tuesday morning in late October. This time, the yellow strobe lights on the cab roof were turned off, and the truck slowed to a crawl, long before it reached the mail post. Gideon Cross stepped down out of the cab. His military straight spine was slightly curved. His aluminum clipboard dangled loosely at his side, instead of being tucked under his arm. And in his right hand, held flat against his belt line, was his official county cap. He walked across the gravel yard in his polished tan boots. Boots that had never once in 3 years found a legitimate purpose on farm ground. Nora stood by the open drying shed, sighting down the edge of a quarter-sawn white oak slab, with a brass folding rule held firmly in her right hand. Elias's initials, stamped into the brass end plate, shone bright where her thumb rested. She did not walk out to meet him. She let him walk the full 60 yards across the gravel drive. "Miss Vance," Gideon said quietly when he reached the shed roof. "Not sweetheart. Not honey. Just her name. Mr. Cross." Nora replied, her voice completely even. In the 36 months since Gideon had stood on her porch calling her inheritance a junk pile, spring floods had struck Calloway County twice more. Every high-water event left the road department with the exact same recurring crisis. Massive log jams wedged under bridge abutments, root wads blocking culverts, and drowned timbers choked along 3 major creek drainage systems. 4 properties now. The Denning Tract, the Fairground Bottom, 2 miles of the Whitlow Riverbank, and Gideon's entire professional reputation had been built on one simple municipal arithmetic. Wood in the water is a dangerous liability, and a liability carries a heavy disposal fee. Except now, there was a 27-year-old woman 11 miles from his office, shipping river-recovered white oak to high-end furniture cooperatives on standing quarterly orders. And the county commissioners had started asking him sharp questions during public budget meetings, questions about whether the timber he had been burning and burying for 12 years might possibly have had a real dollar value on it. He did not know. That was the whole truth. He had spent a 30-year career hauling wood away without ever once learning how to read a single grain line. He possessed a printed fee schedule where real practical knowledge should have been. "I've got storm debris blocking 4 main culverts along the river road," Gideon said, choosing his words with immense care, stopping to find a phrasing that wouldn't destroy his remaining pride. "I don't have the expertise on staff to grade the timber." There it was, laid out in the open air between them. He asked if she would come look at the sites. He asked if she would sort the logs. He asked what she charged, and there was a small, quiet hopefulness in his voice, hoping the number would be small enough to leave his dignity in one piece. Nora folded the brass rule shut. "Click. I'll need a written receipt for every load," she said. 4 words, that was all she gave him. No lecture. Not a single reference to the morning he had laughed at her over the hood of his truck and told her that pulling junk out of a creek was a fool's errand. Not one word about the $4,560 disposal fee he had attempted to charge her for taking his problem away. She simply laid out professional terms. She would not act as a consultant for an hourly wage to make him look competent in front of county commissioners. She would buy the salvage timber at $10 a ton, site graded by her alone on her walkthrough, with zero negotiation on timber selection, and anything she passed on remained his problem at his own disposal fee schedule. Written receipt for every load, both signatures dated. Gideon calculated the arithmetic out loud, haltingly, and then stopped because $10 a ton coming in was infinitely better than $80 a ton going out to a landfill. And the difference across 4 river sites was somewhere north of $40,000 a year in fees he no longer had to justify to the county board. "Agreed," Gideon said, signing the transport form on her truck tailgate. 20 autumns later, Blackwood Creek runs clean and clear through Whitetail Ridge. Nora walks the bank in the early morning cold, her leather boots wet to the ankle, wearing the same faded olive canvas jacket, now soft as flannel from 20 years of washing. Her honey blonde braid is silver now, thick as ever, loose strands at her temples catching the pale sunlight. Where the creek bank used to collapse in orange clay sheets during spring rains, there stands a solid retaining wall, constructed of stacked white oak butts and root wads, pinned deep with steel rebar, and buried 3 feet into the ground. And over that, 20 years of sycamore roots have laced into the timber cribbing, until you cannot tell where the wood she laid stops, and the wood the land grew begins. The clear water flows over smooth, clean gravel stones. Up the hill, 3 open-sided drying sheds sit under the autumn sun, holding 15,000 board feet of seasoning timber. A young apprentice named Samuel, 22 years old and all elbows, stands at the bandsaw, learning to feel the subtle resistance of the wood grain before making a cut. Nora hands him the worn brass folding rule and Elias's third leather notebook. "Waste is just a failure of imagination," she tells the young man, looking out over the clear creek water. "Go find some. Somewhere near you there is a pile of something everyone else has written off. Go look at it twice. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told what they have isn't worth the trouble. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever checked something everyone else had already written off, I want to hear what you found. Every comment gets read. Everyone.